Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the chaos of sources and information overload and distill it into genuine, durable understanding. Today, we are immersing ourselves in the mind of a true titan of modern art, a figure whose single most famous work is so universal it transcends language, culture, and the boundaries of the art world itself.
We are, of course, talking about Edvard Munch, the Norwegian painter born in 1863, whose 1893 masterpiece, The Scream, stands as perhaps the defining visual representation of modern existential dread.
It really does. That agonized face, the swirling blood-red sky, it is the very definition of, angst translated directly onto a canvas.
It is.
Okay, so let's unpack this and set our mission. We have a vast stack of sources that documents a life shaped by relentless personal tragedy, financial hardship, and this near constant debilitating fear of inheriting madness.
And yet, this is the same man who essentially founded the Expressionist movement, dragging Western art out of polite society and really into the dark reality of the psyche.
Our mission, then, is to follow that painful thread. We need to understand the psychological crucible, that constant state of torment that forged his entire vision.
And critically, how his personal suffering ended up fueling such a monumental and revolutionary shift in aesthetic thought.
What's truly fascinating, and I think what underpins this entire deep dive, is the core paradox. Munch consciously treated his art as his soul's diary.
Right.
He wasn't just illustrating pre-existing human emotions. He was extracting the raw sensation of suffering from his own deepest experiences, sickness, loss, terror, and translating them into these universal, almost mythological themes of life, love, and death.
You made his illness his language.
Exactly. And in doing so, he gave all of us a new vocabulary for our own internal lives.
And that universality is why a man who painted images of crippling isolation is one of the most recognized artists globally. To appreciate the profound power of that language, you really have to start where the suffering began. We have to look at the shadowed life in Norway, where the seeds of that generational anxiety were first sown.
So Munch was born in Odelsbruk, Lutton, Norway, in 1863. On the surface, the family environment seemed, well, established. His father, Christian, was a military doctor and medical officer, and they had clear connections to the arts and academia. Relatives included the painter Jacob Munch and the respected historian Peter Andreas Munch. They were a family of intellect and service.
Yes, established but constantly shadowed by poverty and disease. The family lived in what historians describe as genteel but perennial poverty.
So they had the name, but not the money.
Not at all. Christian Munch's pay was low, and his attempts to establish a profitable private practice largely failed. They moved frequently from one cheap, cramped flat to another in Christiania, which is now Oslo. This instability and low income, it just added stress to an already fragile household.
And then the tragedy began almost immediately. These early losses didn't just cause sorrow, they completely defined the atmospheric raw material for his entire artistic life.
Absolutely. The first blow was his mother, Laura, who died of tuberculosis in 1868. Edvard was only 5 years old.
Just 5.
Then, 9 years later, in 1877, his favorite and arguably most emotionally connected sister, Johann Sophie, succumbed to the same disease at age 15. For the Munch children, tuberculosis wasn't an abstract illness. It was a constant approaching reality, a family curse.
You mentioned the frequent moves in the tight quarters, and on top of that, Munch himself was often sickly, especially during the long, dark Norwegian winters.
He was. He was frequently kept home from school and tutored by his Aunt Karen, who had stepped in as a surrogate mother, and by his schoolmates.
And this detail of childhood illness is key, isn't it?
It's crucial. Because he couldn't play outside or attend school regularly, his main activity during these formative, lonely, and frankly terrifying years was drawing. Just drawing to keep himself occupied.
So art becomes his refuge.
It becomes his only safe internal world. Some of his earliest surviving works depict those claustrophobic interiors, still lifes of mundane objects, and, significantly, the medicine bottles that were a fixture of his home.
Which brings us to arguably the most dominant and psychologically oppressive influence in his life. The father figure, Christian Munch. The tragedy was compounded by this morbid, anxiety-ridden environment that Christian created.
That's the crucial distinction. It wasn't just grief. It was the psychological manipulation of that grief. Munch himself explicitly described his father as temperamentally nervous and obsessively religious to the point of psychoneurosis.
So this created an atmosphere that was just perpetually charged with dread.
It did, and our sources confirm that this wasn't just quiet brooding. Christian Munch actively entertained the children with vivid, often terrifying ghost stories and the Gothic tales of Edgar Allan Poe.
He was actively feeding their minds material designed to maximize fear.
Yes, but the truly crippling element was the morbid, restrictive pietism he used as a disciplinary tool. To reprimand the children, or to control them, Christian would tell them that their deceased saintly mother was looking down from heaven and was grieving over their slightest misbehavior.
Imagine the emotional burden of that guilt. The idea that your simple childish actions, a bad grade, a small lie, were causing eternal pain to your dead mother.
It's a devastating mechanism for internalizing dread.
It creates a state of perpetual internalized anxiety.
And Munch internalized this idea so profoundly that it became the lens through which he saw the world. He wrote that he felt, "The angels of fear, sorrow, and death stood by my side since the day I was born."
That wasn't a metaphor for him.
No, it was a perceived reality, an inheritance.
And this perception of a curse was based on a very real family history. It wasn't abstract fear, it was medical dread. He believed he had inherited what he called two of mankind's most frightful enemies, the heritage of consumption and insanity.
And the insanity wasn't theoretical either. His younger sister, Laura, was diagnosed with a mental illness at an early age. The family history showed this pattern. Out of 5 siblings, only one married, and he died shortly thereafter. Munch lived under the genuine fear that he, too, would succumb to madness.
A fear that critics, as we'll see, were only too happy to exploit once his art started challenging norms.
Oh, absolutely.
It's a compelling detail that before he became this great haunted artist, he actually started on the surprisingly technical path, almost like he was trying to escape that emotional inheritance.
He did. In 1879, he enrolled in a technical college. The sources note he excelled in the hard sciences, physics, chemistry, and mathematics, suggesting a sharp, analytical mind.
Maybe seeking the structure and certainty that was missing in his emotional life.
That's a great way to put it. But his frequent illness has kept interrupting those studies.
And this structural escape attempt failed in 1880 when he pivoted completely, leaving college to pursue painting. This decision was a massive point of conflict, symbolizing the complete rejection of his father's values.
It was a direct declaration of war against his environment. His father viewed art as an unholy trade, not just frivolous, but morally corrupting. The community reaction reflected this. He received bitter, anonymous letters denouncing his choice.
And that parental disapproval was relentless, especially given the family's poverty. As Munch tried to find his footing, experimenting with naturalism and early Impressionism at the Royal School of Art and Design,
He received unfavorable criticism and frequent financial rebukes from his low-paid father. The conflict reached an extreme point when his father, driven by his moralistic rage, destroyed at least one of Munch's paintings, likely a nude.
he destroyed it.
Threw it in the fire. And Christian repeatedly refused to advance him any money for supplies. This tension, the desire for expressive freedom battling an oppressive, moralistic past, that's the crucible. Munch was not just painting. He was fighting for his emotional right to exist outside the confines of his inheritance.
So Munch's artistic and personal liberation, this move away from his father's suffocating pietism, was heavily expedited by the company he kept in Christiania, and this period introduces a key, abrasive, and fundamentally nihilistic figure, Hans Jaeger.
Jaeger was a defining presence in the Norwegian bohemian scene. He lived by the philosophy that a passion to destroy is also a creative passion. This relationship was instrumental, almost like a psychological prescription for Munch.
A prescription? How so?
Jaeger advocated that Munch should stop trying to paint what he saw and instead write his life, meaning explore and externalize his own unique internal emotional and psychological state.
That's where the idea of soul painting is born. It's a revolutionary instruction. Stop copying reality, start plumbing your own depths.
And Munch embraced this mission, setting an undogmatic, highly personal stance toward art. He recorded in his diary that his goal was to explain life and its meaning to myself.
That's a profound shift.
It's the definitive break. Moving from observing the exterior world, which Impressionists did, to mining the interior world for truth. That's the foundation for Expressionism.
And he certainly immersed himself in the bohemian lifestyle of that circle.
He did, though with some reluctance and later cynicism. While he resisted the sexual revolution and was initially described as reserved, he adopted the heavy drinking and brawling typical of Jaeger's circle.
And that experience.
It left him cynical about sexual matters, an attitude he later expressed in writings like his long poem, The City of Free Love. This period, while messy, forced him toward the radical emotional honesty required for his true art.
That cynicism and radical honesty directly inform his definitive rejection of the prevailing art movement, Impressionism. How did he articulate his critique?
He found Impressionism completely inadequate for his needs. He critiqued it as superficial and too scientific, concerned only with recording transient light effects. He felt it failed to provide the necessary depth of emotional expression.
He didn't want to paint the moment. He wanted to paint the memory and the feeling associated with the moment.
Precisely. He needed to explore situations brimming with emotional content and expressive energy.
And the definitive proof that he'd found this new path, the visual manifesto of soul painting, came in 1886 with The Sick Child, based on the agonizing, drawn-out death of his sister Sophie.
The Sick Child marks the true turning point. Munch considered this his first definitive soul painting, the first time he successfully translated deeply felt trauma. It wasn't a naturalistic portrayal at all.
What was he doing technically?
Well, if you look closely at the technique, the surface is scraped, the forms are blurred, the color palette is morbidly restricted, focusing only on the pale skin of the child and the dark despair of the woman holding her hand. All the secondary detail, like the interior, is completely dissolved.
So he uses visual techniques, the scraping, the blurring, to convey the pain of the memory, not just the clinical reality of the scene.
Exactly. That's the move into synthetism, the synthesis of observation and feeling. The critical reaction was a violent outburst of moral indignation from the community and critics.
They saw it as offensive.
Offensive, unfinished, and technically incompetent. We have this horrifying quote from Johann Scharfenberg, who explicitly accused Munch of being a madman whose art was insane, directly linking the quality of the work to his documented insane family heritage.
That's a brutal, direct weaponization of his personal history against his artistic innovation. It confirms that he had struck a nerve not just aesthetically, but morally.
It absolutely did. But thankfully, he had powerful defenders who understood what he was trying to achieve, most notably the painter Christian Krogh. Krogh's defense is historically crucial because it provided the theoretical basis for Munch's work.
What was Krogh's core argument?
Krogh argued that Munch sees only the essential and subordinates everything else, composition, realistic lighting, technique, to conveying what he felt.
And to the critics who dismissed the painting as not complete or sketchy.
Krogh retorted that Munch's pictures were complete. He said, "Art is complete once the artist has really said everything that was on his mind." This reframed the entire debate. Completion was now emotional, not technical.
This validation, though contested, allowed him to continue exploring, spending the rest of the 1880s and early 1890s refining this new expressive idiom.
He did. He continued his stylistic experimentation, cycling through various brushstroke techniques and palettes. We see naturalism in some portraits, yet a clear shift towards symbolic weight in others. But the elements of his mature style begin to crystallize clearly in works like Inger on the Beach from 1889.
That piece caused another storm of confusion and controversy, as our sources note. But visually, how did it point toward the scream?
It showed a move towards simplified forms, heavy outlines, and sharp contrasts. The figure of Inger sits on a rocky shore, but the elements of the composition, the white mass of the beach, the dark, simplified sea, the monumental static figure, are used to convey a sense of brooding solitude, not a pleasant day trip. It's emotionally charged through simplification.
And this experimentation culminates in the works that officially cross the border into symbolism, moving beyond just personal confession to the creation of universal mood.
That's where Melancholy, painted in 1891, comes in. Christian Krogh recognized it immediately as the first symbolist painting by a Norwegian artist. This piece is key because it's where color becomes the explicit, symbol-laden element.
So the shift is complete. He's no longer painting a person who is sad. He is painting the state of melancholy itself, using color and line as the emotional shorthand.
Precisely. And this recognition of his unique voice is what led directly to his first major one-man show, and critically, to a state scholarship to study in Paris, launching him onto the international stage.
That state scholarship in 1889, a 2-year grant, took Munch straight to Paris during the excitement of the Exposition Universelle. This travel proved absolutely instrumental, not because of the formal instruction he sought, but because of the radical influences he discovered.
Right. He attended Leon Bonnat's studio briefly, which he found, in his words, numbing. Academic training was still rooted in realism, and Munch had already emotionally rejected that.
So his real education took place in the galleries.
Exactly. He absorbed the post-impressionist masters who were redefining color and form. Paul Gauguin, Vincent van Gogh, and Henri de Toulouse-Lautrec.
These artists were pioneers in using color and distortion not just to represent reality, but to convey a psychological or emotional reality.
And Munch found a spiritual kinship, particularly with Gauguin's philosophy. Gauguin advocated a strong reaction against realism, and the credo that art was human work and not an imitation of nature. This resonated perfectly with Munch's mission to paint his soul's diary.
He didn't need to travel to exotic locales for inspiration. The exotic landscape of human emotion was already within him.
Exactly. One of Munch's friends observed that Munch need not make his way to Tahiti. He carries his own Tahiti within him. That's the essence of symbolism. It gave Munch the theoretical permission to continue simplifying and distorting reality to access that inner truth.
This period in Paris also led him to an important practical realization regarding his production. He needed a scalable way to reproduce his emotional confessions.
That's when he started experimenting heavily with graphic arts, specifically lithographs and woodcuts. He was inspired by Gauguin's use of printmaking and the German artist Max Klinger. The woodcut in particular proved structurally perfect for his nascent expressionist imagery.
Why was a woodcut so much better for him than, say, a detailed etching?
Because the woodcut demands simplification. It naturally encourages strong, heavy outlines, flat color areas, and minimal abstracted detail. These visual qualities were already central to his painting style, like in Melancholy.
So it let him repeat his motifs and generate income.
Yes, and that was crucial because he famously hated to part with his original paintings. He became a huge innovator in the woodcut medium in Norway, alongside Nikolai Astrup.
While he was in Paris, tragedy struck again. His father died in late 1889, leaving the family essentially destitute. Munch had to return, arrange a large loan, and assume financial responsibility for his siblings.
The emotional impact was severe. He was plagued by suicidal thoughts, writing in his journal, "I live with the dead, my mother, my sister, my grandfather, my father. Kill yourself and then it's over. Why live?"
That's the mental state he carried with him as he traveled to Germany.
He is. And it was in Germany in 1892 that his career exploded into international controversy. Adolphe Norman invited him to exhibit in Berlin.
This was the moment Munch presented his definitive synthetist style to the broader continental art world.
And the results were immediate and explosive. The exhibition was deemed so controversial, so offensive to bourgeois taste, that it was dubbed the Munch Affair and was closed after only 1 week.
Well, why was the reaction so intense? Was it just the themes or the technique?
It was both, but primarily the technique. The public was used to polished, finished academic work. Munch's paintings, with their heavy outlines, raw color, and apparent unfinished quality, looked like a child's work to them. They were nakedly emotional and morbid, challenging societal values of propriety and artistic competence.
Okay, so how did the artist himself react to having his exhibition shut down? Did this validate him or set him back?
Oh, he was ecstatic. He wrote, "Never have I had such an amusing time. It's incredible that something as innocent as painting should have created such a stir." The scandal served as immediate marketing, confirming his radical status and attracting intense intellectual interest.
So Berlin became his international hub. He quickly fell in with a circle of major European intellectuals, philosophers, and writers.
He connected with August Strindberg, whom he painted in 1892, and the Danish writer Holger Drachmann. These figures were part of the boisterous intellectual and drinking circles, meeting at famous haunts like Zum Schwarzenviertel or at the Black Piglet.
And it was amidst these philosophical, often morbid discussions about love, death, and human destiny
that Munch sketched out nearly all the ideas that would form his massive defining series, The Frieze of Life.
This period of intense socialization and intellectual turmoil cemented the visual language he would use for decades. Let's talk more about the key characteristics of this early mature style.
The visual language was rooted in simplification. He stripped away extraneous detail. You see this even in relatively benign works like his casino scenes. He favored a very shallow pictorial space and a minimal backdrop, forcing the viewer's focus directly onto the figure and their psychological state.
He wasn't painting an environment, he was painting a condition.
Exactly. His figures were monumental, often static, chosen to convey a specific psychological condition rather than a narrative action. Think of them as playing roles on a psychological theater stage.
Like in Ashes or Death in the Sick Room.
Right. The figures are isolated, designed to appear symbolic rather than realistic, capturing the condition of isolation and grief. He famously wrote that he sought to paint living people, breathing and feeling, suffering and loving, moving beyond mere genre scenes of people reading or women knitting.
And one technical detail he pioneered during this time would become highly associated with emotional expression, something that defied the idea of a polished academic finish: the drip technique.
The visible drip. It was the deliberate use of highly diluted paint, allowing the solvent to run down the canvas. This wasn't accidental. It was an aesthetic choice, emphasizing rawness, immediacy, and the process of creation itself.
We see it subtly starting in the painted version of At the Deathbed in 1895.
And then it becomes much more central later on, like in By the Deathbed in 1915. It was a conscious decision that later Expressionists would fully adopt as a rejection of academic smoothness.
We now arrive at the inevitable, the work that defined his legacy and the modern concept of anxiety, the scream. It is one of the few paintings, alongside the Mona Lisa or Whistler's Mother, that has successfully made the transition from the elite realm of the museum visitor to the enormous venue of popular culture.
Its cultural status is unmatched. It exists in 4 primary versions, 2 pastels, 2 paintings, plus several lithographs. The market value confirms this status. The 1895 pastel, notably the most vibrant version, sold in 2012 for a staggering $119.9 million.
And that extreme value is matched by its dramatic history of theft, turning it almost into a mythical object.
It has a dark, dramatic history. The 1893 painting was stolen in 1994 from the National Gallery in Oslo and recovered. Then, the 1910 painting was the target of a high-profile, daring armed robbery in 2004 from the Munch Museum.
It was also recovered, right?
It too was recovered in 2006, albeit with minor damage. The work seems to attract drama, which only amplifies its fame.
But what is most fascinating is Munch's own account of its creation. It wasn't just a composition he planned, it was the visual transcription of a genuine psychological event.
It was a moment of complete sensory and emotional overload. He described walking down the road with 2 friends at sunset, a specific location on a hill overlooking the city. Suddenly, the sky turned red as blood.
And he stopped.
He stopped, physically shivering with fear, and felt this immense moment of cosmic terror, writing that he heard the enormous, infinite scream of nature.
His friends kept walking, oblivious, which just enhances that feeling of isolation and unique horror.
Exactly. He was paralyzed by this auditory and visual assault. He later explicitly connected this external terror to his own lifelong affliction, his fear of madness. He said, "For several years I was almost mad. Nature was screaming in my blood. After that I gave up hope ever of being able to love again."
So the painting was the ultimate product of his study of the soul, that is to say, the study of my own self.
Absolutely.
When we analyze the composition, the high viewpoint, the broad bands of garish, unnatural color, the swirling landscape lines that mimic sound waves, it reduces the agonized figure to almost a garbed skull or an embryo caught in a moment of pure cosmic emotional crisis.
It's anxiety distilled into a single terrifying gesture. It is the ultimate expression of that central idea, and it serves as the most famous piece within that massive conceptual umbrella project he developed in Berlin. The Frieze of Life, a poem about life, love, and death.
Let's dedicate some serious time to decoding this frieze, because it contains the entire spectrum of his emotional language. It debuted in Berlin in 1893, initially as 6 paintings under the title Study for a Series. Love. What was the scope he was aiming for with this cycle?
The frieze was Munch's attempt to create a totalizing narrative about the modern human condition. He tapped the very depths of his internal life to examine major recurring motifs: the stages of life, the hopelessness of love, the terrifying power of the femme fatale, anxiety, jealousy, sexual humiliation, and separation.
This wasn't just a collection of paintings. It was intended to be viewed as a single cyclical statement.
Which is why he hated selling the originals.
We can feel that emotional force in works that focus more on atmosphere than figures. Think of pieces like The Storm or Moonlight.
Those are superb examples of using landscape to convey mood. In The Storm, the figures recoil and hold their ears, not just against the sound of the wind, but against the internalized dread that the weather amplifies. They're steeped in a kind of visual dread.
And the grief keeps recurring, showing the enduring impact of his childhood loss. We see this powerfully in Death in the Sick Room.
Death in the Sick Room is a direct, agonizing reworking of his sister Sophie's death. But unlike a traditional painting of mourning, Munch emphasizes the isolation of grief. The figures, his siblings, his father, his aunt, are physically present, but disconnected, separated by the lines of the composition.
They're a collection of disconnected figures of sorrow.
Exactly. It emphasizes that even when surrounded by family, grief is a solitary journey.
The portrayal of women in the frieze is perhaps the most intensely debated element, reflecting his complex, often cynical feelings about desire and love forged in the bohemian circles.
The female figures are notoriously dualistic, representing either purity or destruction. On one hand, you have the frail, innocent sufferers, as seen in puberty, where a young girl sits awkwardly on the bed, overshadowed by a dark, looming shadow, the shadow of sexual awakening and fear.
And on the other hand, you have the devastating, destructive force, the femme fatale.
And the femme fatale is most clearly embodied in the piece he retitled Vampire, originally Love and Pain. In Vampire, the woman isn't a literal bloodsucker, but a drainer of masculine emotional strength. She is depicted with long red hair, burying her face into the man's neck, symbolizing emotional and sexual humiliation and entrapment.
And then there is Madonna, or Loving Woman, a piece where this tension between the sublime and the destructive seems most acute, almost religious.
Madonna is fascinating because it pushes his symbolic use of the female form to the extreme. It is often seen as an expression of his devotion to his model and intellectual confidant, Dagny Jewel Przybyszewska, idealizing her beauty and perfection.
Yet, even in this idealization,
she is framed by a border of spermatozoa and an implied fetal form, reminding the viewer that this idealized sublime figure is still intrinsically tied to biological sexual reality, a reality Munch often feared. It blurs the line between the sacred and the profane.
And despite his rejection of the strict moralism of his upbringing, motifs like the empty cross and Golgotha reflect his lingering pietistic background.
It connects his intense personal suffering to a universal spiritual despair, suggesting that his existential dread had roots not just in his life, but in a search for meaning beyond the physical. It's a remarkable synthesis.
All of his incredible output came from a very specific, almost proprietary artistic philosophy regarding his own work. He hated to part with his paintings.
He viewed his entire body of work as a single, continuous expression, a story that could only be complete when viewed together.
This profound artistic egoism posed a financial challenge. If he wouldn't sell the originals, how did he survive?
This is where his mastery of graphic arts, his prints and lithographs, became absolutely crucial. He used them to reproduce his major motifs, capitalize on his production, and generate a substantial income, all while keeping the original confessions close at hand.
He viewed his art not just as personal catharsis, but as something intended to have a wider, almost therapeutic purpose for others.
He saw it as a kind of altruistic egoism. He offered his deeply personalized art to a wider purpose, stating, "My art is really a voluntary confession and an attempt to explain to myself my relationship with life. It is, therefore, actually a sort of egoism, but I am constantly hoping that through this I can help others achieve clarity."
It's a powerful idea that the most intensely private expression can become the most publicly useful.
Exactly.
The intensity of the Freeze years, though creatively fertile, eventually took an immense toll. The early 1900s mark a period of intense personal turbulence that forced a total reckoning, culminating in a breakdown.
The central emotional crisis was his relationship with Tula Larsen, an upper-class woman who pursued him relentlessly and possessed considerable fortune. Munch resisted her attempts at marriage, plagued by his fear of passing on his nervous family background and consumption heritage.
He was convinced he had no right to get married.
Right. He continually fled her, mostly to Berlin.
But the relationship reached a dramatic, violent climax.
It did. During a strained and temporary reconciliation in 1902, there was an accidental shooting incident. Our sources state that 2 of Munch's fingers were wounded, leaving him physically scarred and emotionally shattered by what he perceived as a profound betrayal. The bitterness was immense.
He channeled that trauma into a dramatic, physical act of self-editing, too.
He took a self-portrait depicting him and Larsen together and literally sawed it in half, separating himself from her completely. That act of physical destruction mirrors the depth of the psychological wound.
And he channeled that bitterness directly into subsequent artworks.
Oh yes, notably the morbid still life, The Murderess, and The Death of Marat I, which clearly referenced the shooting incident and his feelings of humiliation and fear of women.
This intense channeling of raw feeling eventually became unsustainable, culminating in a major nervous breakdown in 1908.
He was drinking excessively, engaging in public brawls, and his anxiety reached critical mass. He reported hallucinations and strong feelings of persecution, describing his condition as verging on madness. It was touch and go.
So he finally checked himself into Daniel Jacobson's clinic in Copenhagen,
where he underwent 8 months of treatment. He had a regime of diet, rest, and electrification, a fashionable treatment at the time for nervous conditions involving low-voltage electric shocks.
But the real medicine was just stabilization.
Exactly, the enforced rest and separation from alcohol and chaos.
When he emerged in 1909, stabilized and physically recovered, he returned to Norway. This post-1909 period is a dramatic turnaround, both personally and artistically.
It's almost a second life. He gained official acceptance. Museums began acquiring his paintings, and the general public, including the critics who had once denounced him, finally began to warm to his work. He was even made a Knight of the Royal Order of St. Olav for services in art.
He was finally accepted in his home country.
He was.
And his style dramatically shifted to reflect his newfound stability. How does the post-1909 style visually contrast with the morbid frieze style?
The contrast is stark. He largely abandoned the heavy black outlines and the morbid, psychologically charged palette of the frieze era. His new style involved broad, loose brushstrokes, a much brighter, more vibrant color palette, and frequent use of white space, giving the works a sense of air and vigor.
So instead of psychic drama, he's focusing on portraits, landscapes,
and dynamic scenes of people at work and play. He was painting health and life rather than disease and death.
With his stability and newfound income, he could tackle truly monumental projects, chief among them the decoration of the University of Oslo's Assembly Hall, the Ala.
The Ala Commission was a massive undertaking, won after a fierce competition in 1911. He completed the work in 1916. It involved 11 monumental paintings covering 223 square meters. Key pieces included the sun, history, and alma mater.
And his intent for this massive public project moved away from the private confession of the frieze.
It did. He articulated a much grander humanist vision. He stated, "I wanted the decorations to form a complete and independent world of ideas, and I wanted their visual expression to be both distinctively Norwegian and universally human." The sun, for instance, is a massive, life-affirming image, a complete counterpoint to the darkness of his early work.
He spent his final 2 decades in solitude at his Ikli estate in Oslo, living a highly self-sufficient life.
Incredibly prolific even in solitude, he continued to paint unsparing, highly analytical self-portraits, such as Self-Portrait, Between the Clock and the Bed. He also shifted focus somewhat towards scenes of farm life, reflecting his immediate surroundings, even using his workhorse, Rousseau, as a model.
It's important to recognize that despite his fame resting on figural dramas, his output contained a vast amount of nature work.
Absolutely. Over half of his painted works were actually landscapes, often focusing on recurrent motifs like the shoreline and the forest. But these weren't mere topographical records. He continued to use landscape to convey emotion, as explored in the recent 2023 Trembling Earth exhibit.
It's profoundly tragic that after finally achieving artistic peace and public acceptance, his career ran headlong into the rise of Nazism.
The ultimate battle for his artistic legacy came in the 1930s and 40s. The Nazis, under Hitler's doctrine, labeled Munch's expressionist work as degenerate art, Entartet Kunst. They removed a staggering 82 of his pieces from German museums.
This was official state condemnation. Hitler personally dismissed such artists.
He did. In 1937, Hitler publicly denounced them as prehistoric Stone Age culture barbarians and art stutterers. When the Germans invaded Norway in 1940, Munch was 76, and living in profound fear that his enormous personal collection, including those very works returned from Germany, would be confiscated and destroyed.
He had nearly his entire life's work stored at Ikli.
He had hundreds of paintings, including key versions of The Scream and the Sick Child, stored on the second floor of his house. He managed to successfully hide them from the occupying Nazi forces.
And his final painting,
Explosion, painted just weeks before his death, depicts a fire and a series of ammunition blasts in Oslo in December 1943, which partially damaged his home.
And this final act of witnessing and painting tragedy on a cold, wet night led directly to his death.
He succumbed to a respiratory illness on January 23, 1944, at age 80. What happened next is a chilling historical anecdote of political opportunism. Despite his family's express refusal of a state funeral, the Nazis completely hijacked the event for propaganda purposes.
They seized the funeral of the man they had just denounced as a degenerate artist to claim him as a Nordic hero.
Exactly. NS Mayor Fritz Jansen and other Nazi figures insisted on a state funeral. Enormous, highly visible wreaths decorated with swastikas, personally signed by major figures of the occupation like Joseph Terboven and Vidkun Quisling, were placed prominently by his casket,
creating a completely false impression.
It was successful in creating the false impression that Munch supported Nazi ideologies, causing immense confusion and bitterness among the Norwegian population.
Despite the Nazi efforts to appropriate his image, his ultimate legacy was one of profound generosity to his homeland.
His legacy is anchored by the incredible bequest to the city of Oslo. Munch bequeathed his remaining works, a staggering 1,100 paintings, 4,500 drawings, and 18,000 prints to the city, forming the core of what is now the Munch Museum collection.
His influence was immense.
Particularly on the German Expressionists who followed his profound philosophy. I do not believe in the art which is not the compulsive result of man's urge to open his heart.
And his market value continues to reflect that universal cultural legacy.
It does. And this high value continues to intersect with the dark history of the era he lived through. There are still ongoing controversies regarding works claimed by the heirs of Jewish collectors, such as Kurt Glaser and Hugo Simon, who were forced into exile and had their collections seized by the Nazis. Munch's Dance on the Beach was the subject of a significant accord just in 2023.
So his work, which began as a private, isolated diary of trauma, ultimately became a battleground for political ideology and remains a towering symbol of universal human fragility.
The perfect summary.
So we've covered Edvard Munch's extraordinary journey. From a childhood shadowed by consumption, poverty, and crippling anxiety, to his emergence as the definitive figurehead of Expressionism. His artistic process was never about seeking beauty or comfort. It was about the rigorous, relentless, and necessary study of the soul.
He proved that profound emotional honesty required a new visual language, one that transcended mere physical representation and utilized color, line, and distortion to convey psychological resonance. The chaotic pain and fear he internalized were externalized, and in doing so, he gave the modern world a visual vocabulary for its own deep-seated anxieties.
I want to end with one of his own poetic reflections on mortality and eternity, a beautiful, almost serene counterpoint to the anguish that drove so much of his famous work. He wrote, "From my rotting body, flowers shall grow, and I am in them, and that is eternity."
That quote is a remarkable synthesis of his life's themes: death, the power of nature, and the continuous cycle of feeling and creation. He believed that even through decay, there is continuity and permanence.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you, the listener. Munch believed his art was a voluntary confession meant to help others achieve clarity. In a world still dominated by constant information overload, pervasive social anxiety, and generalized modern angst, the very condition the scream embodies is the highly personalized, emotionally distilled work of Edvard Munch. That insistence on painting only the essential feeling, perhaps more relevant and necessary now than ever before.